Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now, today's video is about the Great Siege of Rouen in France, Normandy, 1418. Now, there's an awful lot that happened before this terrible siege. What happened after the Battle of Agincourt? All of the events that lead up to this siege. So there's some great stories there. So I'm going to actually delve into the couple of years before the siege. But as you can see, I've made a model of the Siege of Rouen. But let me explain. This is Henry V's camp. It would have been over 1,000 yards away from the city walls because they had plenty of cannon, as we had plenty of cannon. It was a bit of a standoff. But as you can see, I've worked hard to try and replicate one of the known pictures of Rouen from the time, from the medieval times. But more about the model later on. Let's have a look into what led up to the Siege of Rouen. So, after that incredible Battle of Agincourt, the king and his army, they fall back on Calais. He returns to England, goes to Canterbury to give thanks, and then enters London in great triumph. But his army is in dire straits. They have a lot of difficulty. They've got to get back to England. Many of them are on their last legs. So the king, he's safe in England. He is celebrating. Meanwhile, back over in France, the garrison at Harfleur, commanded by the Earl of Dorset there, they've got real problems because the French are getting closer to it. They're starting to close it off. There are no supplies coming from England. So to feed his garrison, the Earl of Dorset raids out into Normandy. In fact, he's gone as far as Rouen itself. But then, between I think it was the 9th and 11th of March 1416, he does a raid. He has 1,040 men-at-arms and archers. About 30 miles away from Harfleur, he attacks the town of Valmont. And he burns it. He gathers lots of loot, food, supplies, and he has it on his toes. But what he didn't realise was the Count of Armagnac, the French leader there, is waiting for him with 50,000 French troops. So there's a bit of a standoff. The English are in trouble. But there are terms offered to the English. Give us one knight, say the French, and we will hold him ransom. Then we want an English bowman, and we'll cut off his right hand. The English refuse. There is a fight. In fact, what happens is the French ride down many of our men-at-arms and bowmen. They reckon around 400 of our men were killed. Well, we killed 3,000 of the French. We then slip away, but we have to abandon our horses and all of the booty. But the French catch us again, and there's another clash. 2,000 French are killed. Now, I've read a little bit about this. There are conflicting bits of evidence, but I think we'd gone out back to the woods. In the night time, the English slip away. The problem the English have is they're exhausted and they are full of wounded. So they decide to march along the beach. Now, I've experienced marching on a pebble beach, and I'll tell you, it kills your ankles and it kills your calves. But now the English, they're marching back to Harfleur, and they're almost within reach, just a matter of a mile or so from Harfleur, when the French army appear on the top of the cliffs. But what they do next is beyond me. They get off their horses, these men-at-arms and noblemen, and scramble down the cliffs. Well, I don't know if you've ever tried scrambling down a cliff in armour. It ain't easy, and many of them lose their footing, begin to tumble. So the English, being the English, put down their bows and arrows, pick up their hammers, their axes, and attack the French at the foot of the cliff. And they do much execution, let's put it that way. When they finish killing the French who are scrambling down the cliff, the English, so angry, now climb the cliff and attack the French at the top. Meanwhile, the garrison at Harfleur has actually heard the commotion of battle. So those who can have ridden out to aid their comrades on horseback and smash into the French behind, destroying them and pursuing them from the scene. It's one of those stories. I've never heard of this. And when I'm reading, I'm thinking, wow, we did this. So now the garrison limp back. Problem is, All of the food and supplies that they had got from Valmont has been left behind. So they were victorious in a way, but unfortunately I think they overstepped the mark. Some historians say, well, they were stupid. Others say, well, wow, look at that English spirit. Me, I think, wow, look at that English spirit. But look at the result. We'd lost hundreds of men, and we did not bring massive supplies back into Harfleur, which is now being more and more surrounded. Not only that, the French have massed a fleet to cut off Harfleur from the English, from the Channel. And that brings us to our next story. So the king has done nothing in 1416 to go back to France. He's building up his army, building up his equipment. But what concerns him is he's heard nothing from Harfleur, except his own patrols have noticed that nothing can get in, nothing can get out from the sea. The French have blockaded the Seine there. So Harfleur is in trouble. It's going to be starving to death because the French armies are also intercepting patrols on the other side. So the king is a bit perplexed. Now, the town of Rye on the south coast of England, brilliant place to visit, by the way, they have gifted the king a craft, either a small ship or a large boat, and it's a fine vessel. And he's very grateful, but he's saying, yeah, but this is no good to me. What's happening in Harfleur? And the sailor volunteers. He says, I know the way. I know the waters very well, and you now have a fine craft from Rye. He says, if you allow me to crew and fill the ship full of supplies, I'll get into Harfleur. And the king backs him. This is the story of the sailor of Rye. Now, the story is from the deeds of Henry V. And they're from the day, written by John Streicher, or Streicher. It's a hard one to pronounce. Geoffrey Hamilton put the book together. What it says is this young sailor, with his crew of 50 men and loaded up with supplies, sails off for Harfleur. And they see that they can't get through the French blockade. So what he does is, so I understand, hoist a French flag. And he sails in amongst all of the French ships, waving, bonjour, bonjour. And he doesn't go straight for Harfleur. He wheedles his way around, described in the book as a wolf sneaking through a pack of dogs, until eventually he wheedles his way and slips into Harfleur. Food has arrived. Now people can eat, but the king needs to know what's going on. A message needs to be delivered. So the sailor of Rye, with his fine craft and his crew aboard, they sneak out in the dead of night in amongst the French ships. They have raised the right colours, bonjour or bonsoir, and eventually he slips out through the French cordon, out with the tide, and he has it not quite on his toes, because let's face it, he's at sea, but he gets back across the channel, and the message is delivered to the king, Henry V himself. Harfleur is besieged. It might just starve to death. So the king now knows that the port of Harfleur is having difficulty, could be starving to death. He needs to lift first the naval blockade so we can get supplies in. So, 15th of August 1416, the Duke of Bedford, together with Roger Earl of March, have an armada of between 200 and 300 vessels. Off they go to see if they can crack the French and Genoese navy that's blockading Harfleur. Now, we outnumber the French and Genoese. They have 100 craft. The problem is 8 of those Genoese craft are enormous carracks, great big high vessels with the forecastle and the stern castle. So the English are going to have a heck of a problem because they're going to be fighting those men high above them. Also, the Genoese have 12 galleys. These are the ships that have oars, so they don't have to rely on the wind to actually move around. So the two at the crack of dawn face each other, and the English go for it. They plough straight into the centre. There ensues a battle that lasts hour after hour. What's going to happen is the English are going to get as close as they can, and they're going to put their grapples onto the French ships, and hove to so that they can really get aboard the French ships. But unfortunately, the French and the Genoese, from their high up forecastles, are dropping down incendiary liquid on fire, quicklime to blind the men, stones, crossbow bolts, darts. The English are having a heck of a time, but they manage to climb on board. Once they're on board, now the savagery that ensues, slaughter. One by one, the English begin to capture these carracks. In fact, they capture 3 of them intact. They destroy one, which sinks. Another one, in its effort to flee, beaches itself and is destroyed. The rest of the Genoese and the French fleet now either sail away to the south or they go into Honfleur as safe haven for them. What the Duke of Bedford has done is he has broken the flotilla that blocked Harfleur. Now the English have the chance. For a moment, they control the approaches to Harfleur. They control the English Channel. Now that was just for a while, but now the king can make his preparations for his conquest of Normandy, his invasion of Normandy. He has amassed an army of between 11 and 12,000 men and up to 30,000 other personnel, craftsmen, carpenters, gunners, pages, squires, all the people you need to set up camp, to dig all of the trenches, all of those kind of things. It amasses a fleet, I think it's about 233 or thereabouts ships, English and Dutch, to convey his armada across to France. The problem is, the French, together with the Spanish and the Genoese, have managed to put together a bit of a fleet, and they are attacking ports on the south coast of England in an attempt to disrupt the king's preparations for his invasions of Normandy. The French know that we're coming, so before the king can actually sail across to France, he needs this armada of the French and Genoese and these Spanish ships to be swept aside. So, 29th of June 1417, an English fleet under the command of Lord Huntington set sail, and just like the battle off the coast of Harfleur, the English fleet plough into the enemy and they destroy it. They sweep them from the seas. The English Channel is now firmly in control of the English king. And just a little note, those ships that fought then, these are the seeds that were sown, the beginning of what we now know as the Royal Navy. So the king set sail with his armada at the end of July 1417. The path has been cleared. He lands at the port of Touques on the south side of the River Seine. He was fed up of crossing bridges and having to fight his way across. He'd learnt all of this on his Agincourt campaign. So now the king's plan is to cut Normandy in half, work his way along the River Seine till he then cuts off Rouen. The key to his entire plan is the city of Caen. 40,000 inhabitants. It's going to be a hard nut to crack. Not only that, it's actually in 2 halves. One half is the citadel. The other half is actually an island. They have built new walls, dug deep ditches, have the citizens of Caen. They have a lot of faith in their new defences. Now, the Duke of Clarence actually goes ahead of the king to reconnoitre Caen. And brilliantly, he gallops into the suburbs and captures 2 very strong points, Abbey aux Hommes and the Abbey aux Dames, one on the west, one on the east. Now, the king, when he arrives on the 18th of August 1417, has brought up his guns, and he, together with the Duke of Clarence on either side and other noblemen surrounding, now can bring their mighty guns to bear on the city of Caen, which has been given the opportunity to surrender. But they will not. They are putting their faith that a French army will come to their rescue and their walls can withstand anything the English have to shoot at them. But they have not met the king's new guns. So you imagine then at this siege of Caen, the king on the west behind the ramparts of this fortified monastery, and then his brother, the Duke of Clarence, is on the other side of the city, as well as other noblemen around. But what the English do with their engineers and their pioneers is they dig earthworks closer and closer to the French, moving their guns with them, getting closer all the time. Also, our engineers and miners are undermining the walls, but the French citizens now, so confident, they countermine. There's little fights underground. But the king, when his guns fetch down battlements overnight, the French, cover of darkness so the bowmen can't see them, reinforce the breaches. The king is losing his patience, and at one stage he actually says to the citizens of Caen, surrender, but he is met with nothing but scorn. So he says, if you don't surrender, no quarter will be given. Now, there was a witness who, I think he was a monk from Saint Denis, he'd heard that when the guns fired, it was like thunder, and they belched forth black smoke as if it had been vomited from hell itself. But the English guns, there were different kinds. They had small guns, and the monk refers to these as raining down small balls of lead. These small guns, they fitted a cartridge that you then fired. It's very primitive. So citizens of Caen were being showered by these small musket balls, I suppose you call them. But also their bombards were firing iron hollow shell into the town, and when they struck the wall, they broke into hundreds of pieces. The king was losing his patience. Beginning of September, the Earl of March brings much needed reinforcements to the king's army laying siege to Caen. And on the morning of the 4th of September, the king, having heard 3 masses, orders a general assault onto the new town of Caen. His first onslaught, however, is beaten back. The French are using burning oil, powdered quicklime, scalding water, as well as stones and crossbow bolts. But there's an incident. A young English knight, Sir Edward Springhouse, actually falls into one of the ditches in front of the French, and they set him on fire and burn him alive by dropping down bales of burning straw onto him. The English soldiers witness this, and they become angry, very angry. But the second wave is beaten back. But then when the third wave goes in, the Duke of Clarence's men attack from the other side. And leading the Duke's men is Harry Ingalls, and he is the first to leap into the breach. Now, the 2 brothers, King Henry V and the Duke of Clarence, meet in the middle of Caen New Town. But the English troops now are crying havoc. Who's going to hold them back? They are so angry. It is said that 2,000 or more of the citizens of Caen were butchered by the English soldiers. After this, 16 days later, the rest of Caen surrenders. And the news of the surrender and the butchery of the people of Caen spreads fear throughout the whole of Normandy. During the winter of 1417-18, the king lays siege to the city of Falaise down in Normandy. Now, I've been there. It's a fabulous place to visit. The castle, absolutely formidable. But the king, Henry V, had learned from his grandfather, Edward III, that you could conduct winter campaigns instead of falling back and keeping your troops safe. No, if you've got the engineers, the builders, the carpenters, don't forget the king had with him 30,000 of these personnel, you can build winter quarters for your troops, wooden huts, little marketplace, food, supplies, and this is what he did at Falaise, although I do understand at one stage the wind blew and blew some of the huts down. However, the siege of Falaise was successful. Soon as this is done, other noblemen are sent around Normandy to subdue other towns. But meanwhile, in June 1418, the king is at the siege of Louviers. Now, this is a little town, but well fortified, high walls, and it had its own guns. Now, the king was consulting with the Earl of Salisbury in his pavilion, in his great tent, when he suddenly bent down. As he bent down, a gunstone, a cannonball if you like, shot where his head had been, shattering the main pole in the pavilion. The king was furious. He and the Earl of Salisbury could have been killed, but the siege will continue for another 2 weeks. But when it was ended, the king ordered that the gunners who had fired at him and the Earl of Salisbury be found. They were found, brought to the king, who had gallows constructed, and all of those gunners were hanged in front of the English army. So while all this is going on, France has been terribly weakened and divided by a civil war. It's between the Armagnacs, Bernard of Armagnac, and John of Burgundy. The Armagnacs are who the English are fighting. The Burgundians are actually on our side. However, May 1418, the Burgundians managed to capture Paris. They take Bernard of Armagnac and many of his supporters and throw them into prison. However, a fortnight later, a Burgundian mob break open the prison and slaughter the Armagnacs. In fact, they slaughtered over 2,000 men, women and children. They committed some terrible atrocities upon their own people. Then they realised that the English could easily attack Paris. So the Burgundians tear up any agreements they had with the English, and they are going to fortify Paris against the English army. They then send reinforcements to this great fortified bridge across the Seine, the Pont de l'Arc, and also they send troops to Rouen. And the English now have a new enemy in Normandy, the Burgundians. In order for the king's army to advance on Rouen, they had to cross the river Seine at Pont de l'Arc. This was a fortified bridge, fortified at one end, and at the other, 400 yards across the river Seine, you had a fortified town. And this was now garrisoned by Burgundian troops. And what they'd done in preparation for the English approach was to sink every single small boat from miles up and down the river Seine. So when the king arrives, he assesses the situation, he can see the small boats that have been sunk, and he finds his best swimmers. How about that in the medieval times? Finds his best swimmers. And they swim out into the Seine trying to raise the boats, but they fail. Not only that, the Burgundians are shooting at them with crossbows, so that's not going to be very nice. So the king orders small boats to be made out of leather and wickerwork. Now, this is going to take time, but guys were there who can actually do this. Now, the only thing I can think of is like the coracles of the Welsh on the Welsh borders there, these small boats. Then they reconnoitre what's going on just south of the bridge, and they find there are small islands, I suppose sandbanks, in the middle of the river. So the king, with his engineers and what they had brought with him, build a pontoon bridge to the middle of the river. Now, Sir John Cornwall, together with 60 men, used the small leather boats to ford the second half of the river. But it's not just the men. They bring a horse behind them. This horse swims across with 3 small cannon. This is amazing stuff, isn't it? They then start to bombard the town at the back of the river, the Pont de l'Arc. Meanwhile, the rest of the army ford a bridge. They actually build a bridge using the small wooden boats and bring on 5,000 troops and assault Pont de l'Arc from behind. Very soon, it capitulates. The king has captured it. He will now garrison it himself, so the road to Rouen is finally secure. So, before we go any further, I suppose I ought to describe what the old city of Rouen was like. Well, first of all, it had a population of 70,000, and it was said to be one of the richest and finest cities in all of France. It was famous for its cloth and its gold merchants there, and some of the goods that they manufactured were easily sent up the River Seine to Paris. It also had a fine cathedral, 70 churches. Now, the merchants' houses, apparently there was no expense spared. These were quite incredible houses. And so much so, the guild halls within the city of Rouen, they were better than any guild hall in all of England. But on top of that, this city had some of the best defences you could find in Europe. To start off, it had 5,000 men-at-arms. These were commanded by the captain of Rouen, Guy de Boutillier. He was an experienced and able commander. He was also a member of the nobility of Normandy. On top of his men, you had 15,000 militia. Amongst them, some of the famous hand-picked crossbowmen under the command of Alain Blanchard. Then you had your artillery, an abundance of artillery, commanded by Jean Jourdain, who had over 2,000 gunners at his command. So it's of no surprise that the inhabitants of Rouen, the Rouennais as they were known, were quite confident to sit behind their walls and wait it out. So those walls that they were going to hide behind, there were actually 5 miles of them. Can you imagine that? And not only were there 5 miles of walls, they had improved those walls by building an earth bank behind them so they could take the hits from the cannonballs. There was also 60 towers, these great towers. Now each one of these towers had 3 guns halfway up, and these guns all pointed in different directions. In front of each gatehouse there were 5 gates. There were great bastions bristling with guns apparently and defences. There were guns along the battlements of all varying sizes, and behind each of the gates, the 5 gates, there was also a trebuchet. Now the city itself was protected on one side by the River Seine, but the rest of it was by the town ditch. Now this had been improved. It had been widened, dug very deep, and had been filled with what they call wolf traps. Now, I've seen one of these. It's the clamp. It shuts, it's the jaws that then break your leg. They're nasty pieces of work. Now, on top of all these defences, the city itself had a great water supply, and they knew that the English were on their way, so they had spent time gathering supplies and all of that kind of stuff. They were so confident that they actually opened the gates to refugees who swelled the numbers of the inhabitants inside. The Duke of Burgundy, John of Burgundy, had actually promised, come what may, I will come to your aid. But the fact is, we knew everything about Rouen. We knew how many soldiers, how many weapons they got, because Henry V, God bless him, had an English spy working for him within Rouen. So Henry V, together with his army, arrive at Rouen on the 31st of July 1418. I understand they must have arrived in the evening, because when the Rouennais, the inhabitants, woke up in the next morning, they were completely surrounded. The English had 5 fortified camps. Now obviously it takes time to get all of this done. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've made a model. The problem is, the English camps were over 1,000 yards away from the French, from Rouen, because they didn't want to be hit by crossbow bolts and cannons. So I couldn't actually do that. Otherwise, my model of the camp would have been through the door and across the way of my basement, which wasn't practical. So let's imagine there is an enormous gap. So, the English camp. You actually have a campsite here. You have armour being cleaned. You have a temporary bread oven. And you can see a bowl of pottage there being boiled up. In fact, there's 2 bowls of pottage. That's your oats, peas, beans and barley all boiled up into that stew. Then here it looks like a lamb or a mutton, a sheep being roasted. You've got your monks at prayer conveniently next to a beer barrel, and I can understand that. You've got lots of ladies here who will be about their business, whether it be cooking, whether it be helping repair clothing. They are there as part of the company. You got a water carrier here. He's filling up from a water barrel. But if you look, there are tents, a temporary shelter maybe, a pavilion. This is changing, because when Henry V arrives at Rouen, he's already prepared that they will make winter shelters. So as you come along this side, your campsite will transform into a bit of a town, so that they will actually have warm accommodation. And there will also be bakeries set up. There's 30, 40, 50,000 people in 5 different fortified camps. So you will have 10 to 15,000 soldiers, and then you will have gunners and everybody else. They all need to be fed. They all need to have their accommodation. So you've got your second line of defence here, where you do have your mangonels and your trebuchets ready to be shot. But as I mentioned before, this is 1,200 yards or thereabouts away from Rouen. So these would have had to have been advanced, or are these used against your soldiers from Rouen who actually sally forth? The mangonels here, they were quite manoeuvrable. You could wheel them into position. They were wound back under torsion. Yeah, rope there, really. And you release, the arm swings forward, snaps against here, and the stone is slung forward. But the trebuchet, which carries like half a ton weight, you can wind him all the way down, put a sizable ball in there, 20-pound ball. You could even have it hollow, filled with oil so it can burn, and away that goes. This is the more powerful. But interestingly, the English had them, but it was the guns now. Because Henry V, he's often, he is the archer king, he used the archers at Agincourt. Actually, he was more gunner. He really knew how to use his guns. And if you look, you've got a gun crew, and they've elevated the front of the gun. Now, of course, if he fired, he'd just blow a hole in his own palisade. So, a couple of ropes, haul back, lifts it up, kaboom! Lower it as quick as they can so the enemy can't retaliate. And if you have those all up and down, the guns can keep firing. You take the siege of Caen, they were firing all day and all night. You've got extra guns. You've got some crossbowmen. And of course, your archers. And then in front of that, you have the main defence, this palisade, this wooden palisade, which really does separate you from the enemy. And in front of it, you have the defensive ditch. So anybody who's going to attack this camp, they've got to get across the ditch and they've got to get through this palisade. Not only that, they've got to come across a wide expanse of open ground, no vegetation. But if you look at the battlements, you've got hoardings, you've got roofing over all of the towers, and you can see the 3 guns. So anybody who got close to this would literally be shot to pieces. Apparently there were guns all the way up in the hoardings as well. So Rouen itself, wow, don't go anywhere near it. All of these camps will eventually be linked together by trenches, but there's more to it than this. There's another problem that the English have when they arrive. So I say the English had a problem when they arrived at Rouen. There was more than one problem. There were several. The first one they had to counter was enemy ships in the River Seine. So the English couldn't get anywhere near the river to do anything. They could be fired on by these ships. So the English need to bring their ships to bear, but they can't sail them down the Seine in front of Rouen because their ships would be blown out of the water. So what do the English sailors do? Haul their warships out of the River Seine, mounted on wheels, with their sails fully out. The wind catches them and they haul and pull their ships across 4 miles of land and then relaunch their ships to the eastern side of Rouen. Now they can attack any enemy ships. The enemy simply get their ships into Rouen. They're safe. So now the English control the Seine. So they lay 3 chains across each side of the River Seine. One at water level, one 18 inches below, one 18 inches above. These were great chains. They've been bought on purpose. Our king is thinking about this months and months and months in advance. So now the navy guards the Seine. The Rouennais, they can't actually use the River Seine at all. But then there's another problem. As they dig their trenches round, of course, when it comes to the River Seine, the English messengers going from camp to camp have got to row a boat across. So the king gets his master carpenters at work. They drive wooden pilings into the riverbed of the Seine and lay a wooden bridge across. Apparently it was an engineering feat. People went, wow, that is absolutely incredible. So now you have complete surrounding of the city of Rouen. But then, on the eastern side, there was the fort of St. Catherine upon a hill. They've got to capture that. Then, just up on the Paris road, there was the town of Cudébec. which can fire upon anybody who approaches it. So the Earl of Warwick, within a week, captures the town. Rouen now is secure. The king sends messages to England. And it's kind of what they call a Dunkirk in reverse. Instead of little ships coming to France to take away an English army, we have little ships coming from England filled with victuals of all kind coming to Harfleur, and then the food is transferred, sailed all the way down the Seine to the garrisons laying siege to the city of Rouen. The king is going to starve them out. So whilst the king was actually consolidating his camps, getting things going, he came up with the idea that he could release troops to terrorise the locals around about. So that would secure all of the land about. And one of the groups of soldiers he used were under the Earl of Ormond's bastard son, Fra Thomas Butler. He was the prior of Kilmainham, and he was also of the Irish Knights Hospitallers. He had 1,500 men. Now these men, they were saffron cloaked, and they were the Irish kern. They were javelin men and knife men. They rode small ponies. The king knew all about these. He'd seen these ponies and he'd seen these men when he was a boy in Ireland. And he knew that when he let them loose on the local population, they would terrorize them. There will be terrible bloodshed. It will shock the locals. Stay away or die. And you imagine these hordes of Irishmen yelping and shouting their war cries, the bagpipes, javelins being thrown. The Norman peasants were absolutely terrified of these Irish warriors. Some of them were so bad that the king saw when they returned to camp, they had severed heads tethered to their saddle prows. The king, he thought they'd gone overboard. Too bad. So he had some of them flogged. But he did use these Irish troops to bolster some of the danger spots along the front of the English fortified camps, because the garrison from Rouen would often sally forth and attack the English positions. Some of these sorties out from Rouen with the French soldiers, they numbered up to 1,000 men. So they weren't just little groups attacks, they were full on. And the king was furious at what they were doing. So any prisoners that were captured, any French prisoners that were captured, were actually hanged in front of Rouen. Basically, the king was saying to them, if we catch you, we'll hang you. Now, there were lots of them killed. Lots of the French were killed in these. I've put actually some out into the gatehouse here where they were killed. But Alain Blanchard, the commander of the crossbowmen inside Rouen, he did something quite mean. He didn't just hang English prisoners in retaliation. He strung them up from the battlements with a dog tied around their neck. So you can imagine the dog tearing the throat out of these English bowmen. Then he tied other bowmen inside a sack with a starving dog and then threw them into the River Seine. The English witnessed all of this and they were furious. They were hateful. So the king has got to hold them back. On top of all of this, the Vicar General of Rouen shouts from the battlements a message to the King of England. He excommunicates him. This angers the king, but interestingly, the king doesn't forget both what the Vicar General has said, but also what Alain Blanchard has done to his men. Now, the siege was barely a month old when food began to run short inside the city of Rouen. Now, that's no surprise. Remember, 70,000 inhabitants, plus the soldiers, plus the militia, and all of those refugees who'd been brought inside. On top of all of that, the English managed to divert part of the fresh water supply. So now, not just food is in short supply, but also fresh water, and plague breaks out. The dead pile up in the streets, but the Rouennais are confident that aid will be brought to them because they've sent messengers out. That's great, isn't it? Messengers could get through the lines all the way to Paris, begging for help. And John of Burgundy had promised it. He says, I will bring an army and we will be there 4 days before Christmas. The locals were so confident. They rang out the church bells. And the English were also afraid. of the Burgundian army. It might turn up, it might surprise them. The king had ordered on one occasion at least that everybody sleep fully armed. Now the Duke, he did come to the aid of Rouen, but he had a problem. His army was made up of Burgundians and Armagnacs. And about 20 miles outside of Rouen, a squabble broke out. Don't forget, these two factions had been at civil war for years. This argument then turns out to be a full-scale fight. John, Duke of Burgundy's army simply disintegrates. Rouen is on its own. Nobody is coming to their aid. We know what went on in Rouen city after the Burgundians failed to lift the siege, because there was an eyewitness. He would have been an unknown English soldier. His name's John Page. He actually wrote an incredibly long poem about what he saw. This man was compassionate to the Rouennais, but he was also loyal to his king and believed in Henry's cause. But what he says is they had no meat other than horse, and when that was gone, they ate dogs, cats, mice and rats, peelings of vegetables and dock leaves. He recounts how pretty girls sold themselves just for a piece of bread, but the king was unmoved by the plight of the Rouennais. In fact, he built extra earthworks and blockhouses with cannons bristling on them against any army coming to the relief of Rouen. But it was at Christmas when tragedy really struck. 12,000 of the poor inhabitants, starving, were actually pushed out of the town by the garrison. The elders of the town hoped that they would be allowed to filter through the English lines and simply go away. But no, the king was determined to hold them. He had his soldiers push them back into the town ditch. Now they were trapped. It was raining, and the rain did not abate. People in the ditch died slowly from hunger. And John Page tells us how young children as young as 2 and 3 were begging with their parents dead. In fact, I've got just a small verse of this very long poem. Have a listen to this. And woman holding in her arm a dead child and nothing warm, and children suckling on the pap within a dead woman's lap. He says how in the ditch there could be 10 or 12 dead for every one person alive. As horrible as this is, the king was determined not to let any out. But actually on Christmas Day, he sends in a priest and servants and food to feed those in the ditch. There's also another account where he allowed his soldiers to feed some of the people or the people in the ditch from their own rations. So what happens next is quite interesting, because the King of England, Henry V, offers the people of Rouen a chance of a meal. Come out of Rouen, come into the English camp, you will be fed and you will be given your freedom. However, the commanders of the garrison believe that it is a trap, so no one is allowed to come out. Now, John Page, that English soldier poet, he explains how even hunger can breach stone walls. And he was right, because on the night of New Year's Eve, a nobleman from within Rouen calls out to the English camp. He wishes to speak to a noble Englishman. They wish to negotiate. Now, the negotiations went on for a very long time, back and forth, back and forth. And of course, the problem was, while the negotiations are going on, people are starving to death. And in the end, the poor people of Rouen, the Rouennais themselves, had had enough, and they turn on the rich, calling them traitors, murderers, and they say, unless you come to an agreement, we will kill you. Well, in the end, it was down to the Archbishop of Canterbury and some of the priests within the town to agree terms. And it was on the 19th of January, so we're now into 1419, that if the city had not been relieved, they would surrender. And the king as part of the agreement, was given indemnity of 300,000 gold crowns. 80 hostages were handed over just in case the money wasn't paid, and on the insistence of the king, the vicar general, whose name was Robert de Livet, and also the captain of the crossbowmen, Alain Blanchard, were handed over. Don't forget, the vicar of Rouen had excommunicated the king, and the commander of the crossbowmen, Blanchard, had tortured English prisoners. So Livet was bound in chains and would spend the rest of his life in prison where he would die. Blanchard was immediately hanged from the gibbet. So angry was the king. It was not until the afternoon of the 19th of January 1419 that the keys were actually handed over to Henry V. It was later on that he rode into Rouen city, but what he saw was people in the streets starving, hollowed eyes, pinched nose, pale skin, and corpses lying all around in the streets, and crowds begging for food. So the king ordered that food be brought into Rouen to feed the Rouennais, who were now his loyal subjects. But even though they were now being fed, death continued for days. In fact, they died quicker than the carts could collect them for burial. How sad. The defenders of Rouen were allowed to leave. This was part of the terms of the surrender deal, but they were escorted out of Rouen by English soldiers all the way to the wooden bridge that had been built over the River Seine, which was now called the Bridge St. George. Now there they were stopped, searched, relieved of any money or valuables, and given 2 sous, basically 2 pennies, and allowed to go on their way. Any wealthy-looking merchants or noblemen were also relieved of their wealth. Any handsome coats, gold embroidered, were taken off them, and they were given old garments in return and allowed to proceed. All of the proceeds from this went to swell the king's coffers. Word of what had happened at Rouen spread like wildfire throughout Normandy. Towns surrendered here and there. In fact, some towns surrendered and there were no English there. Such was the fear of the King of England and his English army. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video of ours. If you did, like, share and subscribe. But if you'd like to support our channel further, why not have a look at joining our Patreon community? The link is in the description. Now, before I go, a quick shout out to some of my Patreon members. Now, I've got it written down here so I don't get the names wrong. Here we go. Hey guys, Swampwater, Christine Anna, Flyer Bowman, and Quoth North. There's some great names there. Hey guys, thanks a million. Bye for now.